bringing you the latest in tax credit news, insight, and analysis. This is Tax Credit Tuesday with your host, Michael Novogradac.
Hello, I'm Michael Novogradac, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the March 25th, 2025 episode. My guest this week is Stephanie Naquin, who is based in our Austin, Texas office. Stephanie is Novogradac's Director of Multifamily Compliance and one of our experts in that space. Stephanie is here to discuss some of her tips for qualifying tenants for multiple affordable housing programs. This is the latest installment in our So You Want to Be a LIHTC Developer series. This is a series that we designed to help developers, investors, syndicators, and others learn more about financing affordable rental housing with tax credits. We do have a playlist of all of the previous episodes in this series. It is available on our YouTube channel. I'll post a link to the playlist in today's show notes. Now, today's episode discusses compliance for low-income housing tax credit properties, but that's not all. It's not limited to just properties that use the low-income housing tax credit. It seems like nearly every low-income housing tax credit developer has some level of additional incentives on a given project that also have compliance obligations. It could be property tax exemptions, tax-exempt private activity bonds, could be home funds, project-based rental assistance, public housing, and many, many other incentives. So Stephanie is here to talk our audience through the three primary steps of certifying tenants. And they are screen, verify, and certify. Screen, verify, certify. Now, these steps apply, as I noted, not just for low-income housing tax credit compliance, but for a number of other housing programs. We have a lot we want to cover today. So if you're ready, let's get started. Stephanie, welcome back to Tax Credit Tuesday.
Hi, thank you for having me, Mike. I'm excited to be here.
I'm
Nerd
sorry.
out. Yes.
I'm sorry I didn't go back and check how many times you've been on, but you've definitely become a more regular guest, and we appreciate that. I know the audience does.
Wow. I know it's always like weird for me when I'm like out in the world and people are like, "Oh, wait, are you on that? Are you the Stephanie on the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast?" I get more recognition, I think, in other webinars we do. So I'm happy to participate, and I'm glad it's received well.
Great. Thank you. And thank you again. Now, there are some who are unfamiliar with all the services you provide to your clients. So please take a second to share the services you provide, and then we'll get on to the meat of the podcast.
Of course. So in multifamily property compliance, my team, we're not accountants. I mean, like sometimes I play one on TV, but not in real life. We're not attorneys. Like we are all things compliance. And so our daily activities range from, anything from tenant file reviews to consulting for compliance with state agencies or investors or property owners alike. And so what that does is it gives us a really unique kind of understanding of the breadth of issues that are out there and how to best kind of consolidate them for a discussion purpose. And so don't come to me to calculate your credits, but if you have some sort of issue of noncompliance, I can certainly help you mitigate through that so it doesn't impact that calculation of credit. And we've been very lucky over the last couple of months where the team has grown pretty significantly because there's just, I think, to your earlier point, lots of different programs that are popping up and emerging and a lot of different highlights on these programs that folks are starting to realize, oh, wait, I need to do these things that I didn't realize I needed to do before. And so it's a really exciting time in the compliance world, not just from that respect, but, we have a lot of like legislation that's kind of coming into play. Think about HOTMA. And so lots of moving parts and lots of fun stuff to talk about.
So thank you for that brief introduction. I know you could share a lot more at the time. So in the intro, I mentioned a number of affordable housing programs that managers work with when qualifying tenants.
Mhm.
Please share with our audience a little bit more expanded list of the areas that you find yourself working the most.
Well, I mean, I think when we think about affordable housing, or especially in this context, our brains tend to go to the low-income housing tax credit program, which is, the most prominent, I think, affordable housing program outside of traditional HUD programs. And, an understanding of that program does lend well to understanding how to comply with tenant eligibility requirements in other programs. But there are slight variances. While the basis of income is probably consistent, there's slight variances amongst the programs. And so if we think about the LIHTC program that lives in, the IRC section 42, we also have the tax-exempt bond program. And that has a component of tenant eligibility as well. And it mirrors the LIHTC program, but because there are small carve-outs to it that if you don't understand, then you're not likely going to be able to comply with that program. We can compare that to like the home program. The home program has its own set of rules through home final rule and different home finals that get sent out. And so while its basis of definition of income is comparable to other programs, the verification requirements vary. And so same with National Housing Trust Fund. But local programs is really where we're seeing an emergence of need for compliance support. Because what we're seeing is these local programs being created, kind of to your earlier point, for gap financing, right? To make these deals work. There's no deal out there that's going to work with straight LIHTC. Usually there's some sort of other funding involved. And those small components of funding that are necessary to fill the gap to make the deal work have pretty significant compliance consequences that folks don't necessarily think about when they're putting the deal together. And so, for example, I could have a LIHTC deal that I needed some home funds. So I have a small, home monies in the deal, and I have 5 home units. Well, all of a sudden, having those 5 home units triggers all these other things that are in play that wouldn't necessarily be in play if it was just straight LIHTC. And so really kind of figuring out what is common between all of these programs, and then how do we build out from that basis, complying with each respective program. So that's really the major ones we tend to see: LIHTC, tax-exempt bonds, home, National Housing Trust Fund, of course, all the HUD programs, right? Anything under that. But the cool thing is that amongst all of the programs, they seem to have picked up the definition of income under the United States Housing Act of 1937, which is a fancy way of just saying we pick up the definition of income from how Section 8 would normally do it. And we see a lot of that being applied to these like more nuanced local programs. And the other interesting thing that we're starting to see is not only are LIHTC deals having these other types of programs on it, folks are taking conventional properties that don't have any LIHTC credits, aren't familiar with these kind of compliance reporting requirements, and layering on these local programs maybe to get that property tax exemption. And then all of a sudden they're in this other world where they have to do all these other things that aren't quite as clear. And so that disconnect is really an important thing to focus on so that you're stepping into each program in the right way. Failure to do these things have a different impact based on the program, right? If I'm just straight up LIHTC and I have some sort of tenant eligibility issue, I could have a problem with my credit delivery. I could have some disallowance or some recapture. Conversely, if I had a local program for a property tax exemption and I mess up my tenant eligibility, all of a sudden I could be paying property taxes. So also understanding the interplay of the consequences for not making sure these tenant files are in order is really important and almost fundamental to making sure you're stepping out on the right foot.
Right. And I always also think of it as it's not as if one program as a general rule trumps another program. It's to satisfy everyone. So it's
I'm
for
so
that
glad.
it's the least common denominator test.
Yes. I am so glad you brought that up because it's always so in my previous life, I was the director of compliance with the Texas Allocating Agency, who was, a LIHTC allocator, bond issuer. We were PJ for homes, all the different programs. And from a regulatory perspective, it would drive me crazy when people were like, "Oh, I'm doing the most conservative." I'm like, "That's not how this works. There's not a most conservative. It's just wrong or right." It's like this program has this rules. You need to comply with these rules. You can't really say this is most conservative. So if I do this, then by definition, I will or by extension, rather, I'll comply with all the other programs. Does not work that way at all. And so I'm so glad that you brought that up.
So in the intro, I mentioned the 3 key steps, which we discussed when we were preparing for the podcast. They were screen, then verify, then certify. But I'd like to take our audience through each of the 3 steps, and they are sequential to a certain extent. They can, you could be working on multiple ones at the same time, but you basically have to screen first, then verify, then certify.
Yeah.
Let's start with screening. What do you want to share with our audience? What are some points to keep in mind with respect to screening?
Definitely. But before I do that, I just want to remind everyone Definitely lots of components related to complying with a program. And this discussion is very limitedly focused on tenant eligibility. And so I just want to remind folks, you may have rent requirements, you may have student requirements, you're certainly going to have habitability issues and other things. But it's almost if you're not qualifying your tenants, all that other stuff is moot. We're really
Right.
focusing on, right? Like, are my tenants eligible is really the first start. So I like to think of a tenant certification. And for folks who have been doing this for a while, you've probably heard this analogy, but as a story, right? I should be able to pick up the certification, read it, and understand from start to finish what is that household story. And so it starts really with the screening. And I would say of all of the parts, the screening is the most important. It's the beginning of the household story. And so we have to screen for a couple of different things. So the first one is who lives in the unit, right? What household members are there? What are their ages? And that is reflective of my household composition. And understanding who lives in the unit, who comprises the composition of the household, drives for us what income limit I'm going to use to figure out if someone's income eligible. So if I don't know who's in the unit, I first can't figure out what to go then verify. But I also don't know under what income limit I'm trying to figure out if this household is income eligible. And so knowing who's in the unit is super important. And it's not just like, hey, this rowdy group of folks showed up in the leasing office, and I'm going to assume all of these people in front of me are part of the household for this discussion. Because there are certain people that should be considered for the purposes of like unit size, but those people aren't necessarily considered household members for the purposes of income eligibility. So what I mean by that is I could have a live-in aid or a foster child. I'd want to make sure that they're living in the unit. They physically live there. I'd want to make sure that the unit is right size for that. But a live-in aid or a foster child, I would exclude them from understanding how many people comprise the household to figure out the limit itself. And so while on its face value, you're like, oh, that seems pretty easy. I just hand someone an application and figure this out. It's actually a little bit more nuanced than that because you have to, once you understand the disclosure of who's in the unit, how do they interplay with what you need to do next? You also need to screen for all sources of income. And there are a variety of sources. It's not just employment. It's anything that the household earns or is unearned. So it could be employment. It could be a monetary contribution. It could be child support. The point here is ask the questions. If you don't ask the questions, then you won't have the right answers to go on to the next step or the plot of the household story, which is the verification. Same with assets. We're looking for what assets are part of the household. And we do that for two reasons. First, we're trying to figure out the cash value of the assets for the purposes of understanding how I verify the assets. And then second, I'm looking for any income that is earned from the assets because it's the income that's earned from those assets that I'm going to include at that final certification stage with the entirety of the total household income. Some other things that you may want to screen for could be program dependent. So if I am, in a LIHTC program, I'd want to screen for student status. And there's a very specific definition of student status for that program. And that definition is different than for the home program. If I was operating the home program, I would want to make sure I had a separate set of questions specific to screening for student status under the home program. And so that just kind of goes back to knowing what programs are on your property and setting up your screening tools on the onset to put you in the best position for success. I will kind of add, there's no real federal kind of template for what it means to screen for a household or for these different components. However, state agencies or the administrator of the program, they may have very specific requirements on how to accomplish this part of the process. And so I do want to put out a warning, be aware of that, understand what those requirements are and use that. So for example, California, TCAC has a very specific form that they require folks to use when screening for these various sources. And failure to not use it could result in TCAC saying, well, you did not screen correctly. Therefore, none of the other stuff is valid, which can be pretty disastrous. So just understanding that in addition to knowing you need to screen, but how to screen is like a big deal. If you open up a file, there's nothing to tell you who lives in the unit, what their income is. Everything else after that makes no sense. We're just jumping into the plot without a beginning.
And I sort of think of the screening as the data collection phase where you have to have all the questions and collect the data, which primarily is coming from the tenant. And, once you've collected all that data and you on paper, that they're an eligible tenant, then we get to step 2, which is verify.
Right.
So what
Verify.
I'd like to share with our audience about how you verify all the data that you've collected.
It's interesting right now in the pre/post HOTMA world. So just want to remind everyone that the basis on which we determine income eligibility is driven through that, 24 CFR Part 5, which is for Section 8. And the LIHTC program uses that. All the other programs use that as a basis. Well, back in 2016, when HOTMA was released, it fundamentally changed that code. And as a result, it really changed what it meant for us and all of our affordable housing kind of industries or programs, rather, of what is a source of income and how to verify that. And so, said differently, if someone from a federal perspective says, I'm employed in a pre-HOTMA world, the requirement was like 4 to 6 paychecks. Now the requirement is 2 weeks worth of paychecks. Actually, it was 4 to 6 weeks. Now it's 2 consecutive. And so it lightened the requirement. The intention was to modernize what we were doing and to really be more reasonable. And, another example is like child support. If I was in a pre-HOTMA world and someone disclosed child support, the requirement for verification would to be obtain the court order, and you include the full amount of the court order, unless the tenant says they're not getting that full amount and they provide you support that they are actively working with the enforcement agency. In a post-HOTMA world, that's no longer the requirement. You simply just get the payment history and you annualize that out. And so it really kind of depends on what year you're looking now and in what state you're operating and in what program you're operating. So that gets very, very tricky, right? This all seems, oh, okay, cool, screen, verify, certify, but each step has its own kind of quirks and nuances. And in the verify one, HOTMA is really our quirk and our nuance. So for example, how that could affect you, if you are operating in a state like Texas, they have had full HOTMA requirements in place for all of their programs since 1/1/2024. And so you would do it one way in Texas very specifically. But if I was operating in another state that delayed the HOTMA implementation till July of this year, I could be operating in a pre-HOTMA verification world. And so right now it's about understanding like where we are within your own state, within your own program, as far as the HOTMA applicability. And then from there, branching out and figuring out what I need to do. Verifying is just making sure that if they disclose that they're getting something, you need to go verify that information. So if they say they're getting Social Security, you need to go verify with an independent source the amount of Social Security, the gross amount that they're getting. If they say that they're employed, you need to be getting the either paycheck stubs or an employment verification, depending on kind of what the requirements are. And so the task here to everyone is once you understand what you need to verify it correctly.
No, thank you there. And do you have any clients where they have a particular development where some of the programs have to comply under HOTMA and some of the programs do not?
Yeah, we do. And that gets very challenging. So even for us, our internal working papers have to drive kind of how that works. Like it has to be programmatic and then it has to be by the effective date. So luckily under HOTMA or pre or post HOTMA, while there are things that did change, if I am operating in a HOTMA kind of world, to some extent, I've covered myself in a pre-HOTMA world. The inverse
Right.
isn't necessarily true. But the whole program has its own special kind of requirements. And because they're embedded in that home final rule, which is, not something
Right.
that can be changed easily, we have to kind of ignore the verification components of HOTMA and we get 2 months of source documentation for everything. And so we could have a LIHTC deal that is post HOTMA, and they recognize it for the state, but also have home funds. And so I'm having to do more. And I can't, to your earlier point, most
Right.
conservative doesn't work in those examples. Yeah. So it's been very interesting for us as a team to kind of figure out in these various spaces, how do we appropriately provide support for the program and the space in which that program is operating?
We have screen / data collection, and then we have verifying the data collected. And the third being certify.
Right.
Please share with our audience what you think is most important to be thinking about when you're in the certification phase.
Yeah. So the certification is like after you've done everything, it's a collection of that information, summarizing the information in one place. And then it's presented to the household, and it's the end of the household story. And so, for example, you have a one person household and the only thing they have is employment. You verify the employment, and then this income certification form will have who's in the household and then the amount of employment that you calculated. You present it to the household and you're like, hey, is this still correct? Did anything change? This is what culminated through the screen and verify process. And they sign it and they certify to the accuracy of the information. All programs have some component of this certification, and failure to complete this last step, depending on the program, could be pretty disastrous. So, for example, under the LIHTC program, you could screen, you could verify, and forget the last step of completing the income certification. So actually just physically completing the form and having the tenant sign it. And that unit is not considered in compliance with Section 42. And so that has the same consequence on your credit delivery as any other event of noncompliance. And so that last step is really kind of, I like to make my metaphors, the punctuation. Exclamation mark to it. And in absence of it, the household story is not complete. And so that's true of the home program. I see it with these local programs, some variation of an income certification. And that is usually different than the income certification that you're using for other programs you have on your property. So sometimes you're executing more than one types of certifications if you have multiple programs on the property. Just recently, actually an hour before I got on this with you, I was doing kind of a team training over a local program, and we were going through how to review it. And some of the files had the required income certification, and some of the files had a different version of it. And so the question was, does this different version satisfy what the expectation was? And for that program, the answer was no, because the regulatory agreement had an exhibit that says you have to use this form. And so while there was a version of the certification in the file, the correct one that was required by that program wasn't in the file. And so that was like, what do we do here with this? Which can be an interesting kind of dialogue with the client and then, of course, with the administrator of the program.
No, thank you for that. Now, when we were preparing for the podcast, you brought up property tax exemption compliance issues, and that was a particularly hot area. Yeah, I will note that is one. I'll note, this, of course, but I'll note it for our audience. It is something that, in years past, some of the compliance requirements for property tax exemptions, I'm thinking in California, the IRS was taking a position that, that you couldn't take certain steps to comply with the property tax exemption requirements. So you ended up being in a position to have to either decide one or the other or convince the IRS that the IRS needed to change their view, which ultimately I think we were successful with the IRS changing their view, at least informally. But please, for our audience, share with them some of what you're seeing on property tax exemption compliance issues so they can avoid them.
Yes. Something that recently was said to me was specific to a property tax exemption program. And it was with a client, and they were like, well, it's not like it's LIHTC. I'm not losing credits. It's, what noncompliance it doesn't have the same consequence. I'm like, it totally does have the same consequence. You're going to have to start paying property tax. So I'm so glad that you said to start out on the right foot, because I do think with some of these more like local programs where folks aren't used to operating in the affordable housing space, the consequences for not doing so aren't as apparent because they haven't experienced those consequences. And so, I've just seen an emergence of specifically programs related to property tax exemptions, like across the country. I'm getting tons of calls from people who are needing some sort of support, whether it be, pre-occupancy reviews to make sure they're meeting the requirements of that particular program's regulatory agreement, or completing like compliance reporting requirements, like annual reporting requirements that are required to maintain the property tax exemption. And I would say over the last 6 to 12 months, I've just seen like a huge increase in these discussions. And because they're not kind of in like Section 42 has a federal umbrella and has some basic structures of the program. Yeah, there's some variances depending on each state, but overall the structure is the same. We don't have that I don't want to say gift, but for better concept, gift for these local programs. They're very much driven by and created by the local kind of authority that is administering these programs. So their requirements vary wildly from one to another and from state to state. But fundamentally, there is a component of making sure someone is income eligible. So that is the thing that doesn't change. And the definition and the application of determining that is very comparable to how we would tackle it under any other affordable housing program. So it's just acknowledging and realizing that that exists, and you have to do a little bit more sometimes. I often see that if you have these local tax exemption programs on a LIHTC property, folks are used to working in affordable housing, so like it's not as much of a challenge. What I really am seeing more of emergence of are conventional properties that are layering on these like local tax exemption, property tax exemption programs, pulling off the tax roll, and then all of a sudden becoming affordable and not realizing, oh, wait, I need to do more than take my conventional application. Because if I'm doing that, I'm not screening for all the things I need to do, which then puts me into a space where I'm unable to verify. And so even though I might have that certification at the end, there's no support for it. And so we see just a ton of folks who are operating conventionally and thinking, oh, as long as I just get some paycheck stubs, it works. And that's not the case. And so we see a lot of this right now. So Texas, for example, is hot. There is a deadline for June 1st of this year for anyone that has a property tax exemption through what's called a public facility corporation or a PFC. Those reports are due by June 1st of this year. And those reports go to the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs, who then reviews the reports and issues kind of a formal monitoring letter. And that's the space in which findings are cited and they go back and forth with the owner. But the end product of that is actually provided to that public facility corporation in which that the agreement was made and to the local tax appraisal district. And based on that compliance reporting is what the tax appraisal district will assess whether or not that owner can continue to claim full property tax exemption or there'll be some consequence to it. And so knowing now that you have a requirement to do that preserves your ability to maintain that property tax exemption.
Well, I appreciate that. And I know our audience will want to be reaching out to you on that and a lot of other things that you've discussed so far. So I will include your email address.
Yeah. I'm so glad we're having this conversation because everyone just thinks, oh, LIHTC compliant. That's all that is out there. And that is not true. I have more conversations about other programs than I do the LIHTC program these days. So I'm just really highlighting the structure of this and the importance of understanding and how we can help and support folks through that is really kind of clutch in these conversations.
Right. Thank you for that. Before we end the podcast, I do think it'd be useful if you shared with our audience other resources that you recommend they turn to. Obviously, reaching out to you is probably the number one resource.
Yes.
There are other resources at Novogradac.
Yes. Well, okay, so specific to kind of this property tax exemption discussion, there's usually or oftentimes also like a financial reporting component. So taking a look at your operating agreement and making sure that all of your reporting requirements are met. And so that's certainly something else that we as a firm can help with. But if I just think about logistically, how do I do this, right? Like, and who is doing this? It's the leasing agents who are on the property. All of this, everything that we're talking about, maintaining your property tax exemption, delivering your credits, making sure your bonds, retain their non-taxable status, all of that rests on the shoulders of the leasing agents that are on property who are taking these applications and who are screening. So empowering them with the information that they need to know to be successful is really going to be an incredible resource for the operators and the end result. Also thinking about where we are in the world, right? It's 2025. There's lots of software and other resources out there that folks can use that can help maintain the structure and the context of these various programs. So if I have 5 different programs on a property, having software where you can integrate in the various requirements of each one of those programs at least gives someone a place to go to figure out in one place, what are all my requirements? Understanding the regulatory agreements for each program and how they interplay with each other and what resources you need to interpret them. So, for example, I might see local property tax exemptions regulatory agreement refer to adjusted income under Section 142D. Well, I know that that's the tax exempt bond program that discusses minimum set aside. But if you were a conventional owner and just put this property on that program, you wouldn't know that. And so just kind of understanding like the terminology is really important as well. So training, understanding what your resources are, and then empowering your folks to do this. And also just realizing you have to do it. There is a lot of times this kind of struggle or roadblock and in all the programs with like, why do I need to do these sorts of things? And just taking a deep breath, let's all hold hands and jump and just get it done.
Great. Thank you for that. I'll also note to our listeners that we do have our LIHTC conference coming up in San Francisco, May 8th and 9th. And also we have a low-income housing tax credit property management handbook. It's a good resource as well. And I'll include links to both of those items in the show notes. Before we get to the off mic section though, I'd like to remind our audience to subscribe to the podcast, whatever platform you get your podcasts. I'd also encourage you to share with your colleagues particular podcast episodes on more nuanced topics. We find that's a good first step to getting up to speed in a new area. So for instance, if you and your colleagues are working on your first historic preservation transaction, then listening to some of our podcasts on the federal historic tax credit in connection with LIHTC is a great early step. Additionally, as I also say virtually every week, we have a full archive of episodes available on our website at novacode.com. So now let's go to the off mic section. We like to use this space to give a shout out to someone working in the areas where we work. It's an opportunity to highlight a professional worthy of the highlights, worthy of recognition. Stephanie, who would you like to shout out this week?
So do something a little bit different and actually shout out a partner here at Novogradac. So George Littlejohn is a partner here in the Austin office, and he's actually my direct report. And so I've known George forever. That's why even when I was at PBHCA. But the reason I want to shout him out is this is his 30th year anniversary with the firm, which is, I think, like, bravo.
Bravo indeed.
Yeah. And he's just such a great resource, and he's always there for me whenever I need him. And he's, always not there for him when I don't need him, which is equally as important. Right. But honestly, like, I would not be here with the firm if not for George. It was born out of just kind of a conversation that I had with him several years ago. And here I am, like, 8 years later. I can't do math. It started in 2017. It feels like I've always been here, so I'm just going to call it that. But so I really do owe George like a debt of gratitude for this exciting opportunity, and also just for him being him and for sticking with it for 30 years.
Well, thank you for that. That's an excellent shout out. I echo it as well. Novogradac itself is just over 35 years. So you can tell George has been here virtually from the beginning.
Yeah, he told me when I first started, and you know this, we have certain codes that are assigned to us, right? I think yours is number one, but his is number 1, 2, 3. He's like, Stephanie, I was the 123rd employee of the firm. Yeah, he's whatever he's like. So I have been here a while. It's like, okay, George.
Yes, he has, and now we're over 1,000, and we don't reuse numbers, so I'm not even sure what the new employee numbers are, but it's getting up there.
Mm-hmm.
So very good. Thank you again for bringing the podcast today, Stephanie.
Happy to be here, as always.
And to our audience, I'm Michael Novogradac. Thanks for listening.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac and Company, LLP. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac and Company, LLP is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novoco.com.